Well, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on Shapes of Scotland, Maps, History and National Identity. For those of you interested in seeing the slides and the details of the maps I'll show, I have published these at the tiny URL below here, which is tiny.com/Y9NOF46F. For those of you who don't know me, I'm map curator at the National Library of Scotland, where I've worked since 1994. And my main job at the library has been creating and maintaining the Map Images website, where we now make available over 250,000 high-resolution images of historic maps. Just last month, we added 450 new printed maps of the whole of Scotland to our website. And this was partly a cue for looking at the representation of Scotland on maps in this talk today. Maps frame our view of the world and our place within it, but they simplify and select from the world. They misrepresent and distort it, and in doing so, they promote particular ways of seeing it. Over time, as both the makers and users of maps have radically changed, these ways of seeing Scotland have completely altered too, and Scotland appears in a myriad of forms. Back in 2016, the social media news and entertainment website BuzzFeed carried an article entitled 12 Maps That Will Change the Way You Think About Scotland. Now, the particular choice of maps was interesting. Well over a third of the maps were choropleth maps like this, focusing on national characteristics and ethnicity. For example, as shown here, the Old Enemy, the percentage of English-born people living in various parts of Scotland at the time of the 2011 census. Another map, the communist non-British country of birth, making it seem as if beyond the UK, Scotland was being overrun by Germans. And thirdly, what better way of visualizing how many times the population of Scotland compares to that of England than by filling the latter with a saltire? Now, whether you regard maps like this as all good fun, racist, or even quite frightening, there is no doubt that in recent years, cultural origins or national identity is a highly significant issue in people's minds. So in today's broadly chronological and necessarily very selective sweep through time, I want to next look at the emergence of Scotland on maps, then on maps and state politics, as well as Scotland's national atlases, asking the questions, how important are maps in constructing national identity? How important is nationalism as a force in influencing maps? And thirdly, can map history help us understand the role of maps and their effects on national identity? And two important remarks to make at the outset. As illustrated by these two recent postcards, maps are all around us today, but this state of affairs has not always existed. Once maps were the preserve of a literate few, were precious objects written as manuscript, not printed on paper. Although maps as paper documents have been around for several centuries, maps in the public realm are more recent. In Western Europe, maps started appearing in newspapers only from the early to mid-18th century, and as mass-produced items for the man on the street very much from the 19th century. A second point is that as maps have changed over time, so too have ways of understanding them. For many years, emphasis was placed upon map history as a story of technological improvement over time, illustrated by this map by John Cowley, showing the disagreements amongst the geographers, the leading geographers in the 1730s of Scotland's outline. Put simply, this view saw maps progressively become more accurate and faithful documents. And map making was a chronological narrative of progress, a shift from artistic inaccuracy to scientific exactitude. But within the last 30 years or so, these views have been profoundly challenged. Historians of maps have become much more attentive to the use and the meaning of maps, to their social and political contexts. Maps miss things out, they select and they generalize, and therefore they also silence in their choice of names and content. You'll only find North Britain, for example, mentioned on this map, not Scotland, whilst on many other maps of Scotland, Orkney and Shetland are beyond the frame. Sometimes the cartouche and its imagery is more important than the map itself. So quite often, what might have been regarded as the surrounding decorative imagery is actually more important than the map itself. The Union of Crowns in 1603, for example, very much illustrated in map form by John Speed, is of interest to us more for the side panels, indicating the royal authority of King James from afar. When this map was reissued during the Cromwellian interregnum of the mid-17th century, the royals at the side panels were replaced with Scots as well as a Highland man and woman, and this makes a similar point. But understanding maps through their historical context does not need to so obviously link to national identity. Take these two 16th century marine charts, for example. These are only 3 decades apart, but they show strikingly different outlines, content, names and features. The printed map on the left, published by the French cosmographer royal Nicolas de Nicolay in the 1580s, took its information from the pilot Alexander Lindsay, and Lindsay accompanied King James V in his voyage of 1540 to subdue clansmen and islanders in the north. Lindsay had very detailed first-hand knowledge of Scottish waters. The Portolone chart, by way of contrast, was drafted by Giorgio Sideri, who was a frequent visitor to Venice as master of a merchant ship. Not only was Scotland on the periphery of his geographic sphere of interest, but the chart also copies information from at least a century earlier, mixing, as was customary, with somewhat mythical information. For example, at the northeast tip of Scotland, we find the island of Thule, the mythical island of Till or Thule, rather like a no-entry sign here. To the west of Scotland is another mythical island of Skers. You can just see the clover-shaped Isle of Man creeping in on the bottom left-hand side. The chart reflects very different traditions, different draftsmanship, different patrons, and different audiences. And we can't understand either of these maps through any narrative of progress, still less through a prism of how they construct national identity. We have to understand them through the specific historical factors behind their creation. So let's look next at the emergence of Scotland on mapping. Scotland is shown in the early Christian world maps, but where it is shown, it is distinct and always marginal. You can see in this map, orientated with east at the top, the British Isles appear down to this lower left-hand side. And the reasons for this poor coverage are not that people were not map-minded at the time. This is because Scotland was simply geographically peripheral when one mapped the known Christian world. This was a world that centered upon Jerusalem and upon classical European culture around the Mediterranean. But here, as in other medieval maps, Scotland is shown as somewhat peripheral, fragmented. It was not the subject, nor was it known in detail in map terms. Now all that completely changes during the 16th century. The first printed map to show Scotland alone dates from about 1566. It's thought to be the work of Paolo Forlani, a Veronese mapmaker who was active in Venice. It's based itself on an earlier map from the 1540s by an English churchman, George Lilly. And whilst Lilly was a Catholic exile in Rome, he undertook detailed geographical research as part of a wider description of Britain. Half a century later, Scotland, in the form of the Scotia Regnum map, Scotland the Kingdom, appears in the 1595 edition of the Atlas of Gerard Mercator, by then the world's leading map maker. This map was probably based on earlier work, including the Alexander Lindsay map we've just seen. Now, the explanation for this move for Scotland away from Europe's periphery to the recognizable shape that maps reveal by the 1590s rests in three related matters. First, geographical and other intellectual activity. Second, military and commercial needs. And third, questions of national identity and political governance. Let's look a bit more at these three related concepts. To kings and courtiers, to the emergent civil service, maps were documents of authority. On paper, one can view and plan space. For clerics, maps could help delimit the reach of the established church, whether Catholic or Protestant. For men like Mercator, map-making had powerful political as well as intellectual consequences. As a profession and as a practice, as a way of picturing, as visualizing the world, mapping in 16th century Europe profoundly changed the world. Scotland swings into cartographic focus because of these initiatives and the realization of the political power of maps. From the later 16th century, Scotland also begins to be mapped itself by Scots. We know relatively little about Timothy Pont, but his legacy of maps and written descriptions dating between 1583 and 1614 has left us with a critically important view of Scotland from this period. There is continued speculation on Pont's purposes. Was it a survey for the church? How important were economic motives? And how important was politics in delimiting the extents and qualities of the country for statesmen and royalty, alongside similar map-based surveys of many European countries at this time? But it failed in a crucial respect of getting the maps printed and published in Pont's time. The departure of King James I and VI for London in 1603, the death of his father, Robert Pont, in 1606, both reduced the high-level political support for publishing Timothy's work. And Scotland's printing community at the time lacked the technology and the capital for the work itself. So the engraving and the printing of the Pont maps by Johan Blauw in Amsterdam fundamentally transformed their original qualities. As we can see with these two maps, the original Pont manuscript map on the left-hand side and the printed Blauw map on the right, the variety, complexity, and subtlety of Pont's original first-hand record was generalized and standardized into a Dutch aesthetic as part of one of the world's greatest publishing projects. The sumptuous artistry and engraving of the maps represent Scotland through the prism of the Dutch Golden Age. For leading statesmen in Scotland, getting Pont's maps published by Blauw was certainly an important patriotic objective, but it was not a national atlas in any sense. Pont's name lives on the maps, but the stylized surveyor becomes a Dutch surveyor, and the lavish and ornate cartouches and ornaments reflect a very different world to Scotland in the late 16th century. On the one hand, Scots could celebrate this major publishing achievement that put Scotland very much centre stage in European cartography, and finally brought Pont's work to international attention. But we can understand it too as adding much needed bulk to Blauw's much greater publishing project to produce the largest ever multi-volume world atlas. Its impact on national consciousness was even smaller still. The readers of Blau's atlas were a tiny proportion of European society and an even smaller proportion of Scottish society. Let's jump forward now to the early 18th century, which provides another opportunity to look at the influence of maps on Scotland on state politics. Cartouches and their symbology were an excellent way of communicating national messages. The title frame and cartouche to Homan's map of 1710 is at once suggestive of political loyalty, agricultural prosperity, and industriousness. In the years soon after the union of the parliaments of Scotland and England in 1707, national unity had to be worked at. Here a child passes an apple from the tree of knowledge towards the lion and the unicorn and other heraldic symbols, the crown and arms of Britishness. To the left of the image, the beehives up here on this side hints at both industriousness and collective endeavour, while to the right, a spade in the hands of the child stands for hard work in the fields, the garland on his head, a gesture towards peace. The clouds of an earlier, gloomier age roll away in the face of this new political climate. Herman's Moll's map of 1714 well illustrates some of the personal and national tensions between British Union and Scottish independence. Following the Act of Union in 1707, the powerful London-based map engravers and publishers did well in eliding or relegating the name of Scotland from maps of the country. North Britain, or as it appears here, the north part of Great Britain called Scotland, clearly underlined the new political geography and focus for loyalties. Herman Moll worked in London from around 1675 and from there promoted a successful image of the British state and its steadily growing empire. That Scotland was increasingly seen as a source of commodities is hinted at in the note below the title on the map, which notes the fine resources of both fish and wood in North Britain for English markets. If things were rightly managed, though, it says, there would be no occasion to go for Norway for wood or to Newfoundland for fish, seeing North Britain can plentifully furnish us with both. Now, Moll chose to dedicate his map to John Erskine, Earl of Mar, with good reason. Mar had vigorously promoted the Anglo-Scottish Union and was in the zenith of his career as Principal Secretary of State for Scotland. But it was not to be for Mar. Within months of George I's accession to the throne in August 1714, it became clear that Mar, along with most other Tory ministers, had no place under the new king, and Mar quickly reversed his loyalties to the Jacobite cause. After months of plotting and conspiracy, he took a leading part in the Jacobite rebellion of 1715, even though his indecision and military incompetence was widely held to be responsible for its failure. Mar was subsequently forced into exile, rightly mistrusted by all sides and never pardoned. So it must have seemed distinctly ironic that such a pro-unionist map should be dedicated to someone who in the end became one of its chief adversaries. In many ways, North Britain never caught on, rather like South Britain, in spite of endless maps and other written documents throughout the 18th century that promoted the new name and tried to erase the old. So there were clearly other, more powerful forces keeping the name and concept of Scotland alive. In some ways, the Roy Military Survey of the mid-18th century is one of the most powerful cartographic statements of Hanoverian domination over the Scottish Highlands. But it's a mistake to regard it as a British subjugation of Scotland. Many of its leading protagonists, including William Roy himself, were Scots, and there was substantial opposition to the Jacobite cause within Scotland, especially lowland Scotland. David Watson was the primary driving force behind the Roy Military Survey, promoting the idea amongst military circles and the Duke of Cumberland, who promoted Watson to the post of Deputy Quartermaster General in Scotland from 1747. Watson was virulently anti-Jacobite and very keen to rout out Jacobite supporters. He was also closely connected to the Dundas family of Arniston, who was Unionists who held a dominating sway over Scottish politics in the 18th century. The Royal Military Survey was never published and had an extremely limited audience, perhaps a few senior military officers and the king. Unlike the Blau Atlas, which was copied and influenced the shape of the nation for over a century, the Royal Military Survey had no influence on later Scottish map-making in the half-century after it was put together. It was only in 1805 that the London-based map-maker Aaron Arrowsmith was allowed to consult it and use it for his landmark 1807 four-sheet map of Scotland. This map formed the standard map of the country for the next half-century, rightly regarded as a significant national map, even though, ironically, its real quality lay in the military conquest of Scotland. Now, in the 19th century, Scottish map publishing grew in expertise and influence, and two major folio atlases of Scotland were published, very much as patriotic endeavours, firstly by John Thompson in 1832, and secondly by John Bartholomew in the 1890s. John Thompson was a very successful Edinburgh-based bookseller and publisher who had published a number of successful world atlases by the time he announced his Atlas of Scotland project in 1818. As for the Blau Atlas, the maps were printed by engraving on copper and then hand colouring, an expensive process, and it included attractive plates of Scotland's mountains, as shown here, as well as rivers, both pushing up the costs. His income for the atlas rested upon subscriptions, releasing pairs of county maps in instalments from 1818 onwards. But he faced many problems. The surveying of Scottish counties had been very inconsistent, funded by private subscriptions and the county gentry, and updating maps was expensive. His most fundamental problem was that the market for a large folio atlas of Scotland was small, perhaps a few hundred people at best. He filed for bankruptcy twice, on the second time in 1830, with debts of £14,000, perhaps well over £11 million in today's money. But Thompson left for posterity the most detailed nationwide Atlas of Scotland prior to the work of the Ordnance Survey, a memorial perhaps to his own industry and patriotism, and the first folio Atlas of Scotland to be compiled and published within Scotland. Now, when we turn to Bartholomew, the most obvious contrast is that it was the first folio atlas to be commercially successful, with a second edition within 12 years. It was also the first national folio atlas of Scotland to be conceived, designed, printed and published not only entirely within Scotland, but under one roof, the Edinburgh Geographical Institute of John Bartholomew and Company. It was the first folio atlas of Scotland to be printed by colour lithography, employing this relatively new printing technology to produce an array of distinctively coloured maps. These included the famous half-inch to the mile maps, where Bartholomew continually refined their palette of colour from green down at sea level through to hues of brown for higher ground. They also employed layer colouring at smaller scales too, such as in their motoring map. So ubiquitous now, but then quite a cutting-edge idea. Now, the differences in success between these two national atlases can't be explained in terms of national consciousness, but in terms of the prevailing technologies, surveyed information, and map production economics. Lithography allowed maps to be printed cheaply in bulk, and stunning maps could be produced relatively easily compared to hand-coloured, engraved maps. Bartholomew benefited from the recent completion of Ordnance Survey's work mapping all of Scotland by the 1880s, so they had fresh, up-to-date survey information. And very importantly, there was also a larger market by the end of the 19th century, the map-buying public. Now, I want to fast forward now a century to finish with two very recent examples. Who could have predicted 20 years ago that the most common map everyone would be consulting today would be on a screen, owned by a multinational corporation that makes its money only from selling internet advertising? Well, certainly not me. But Google's maps are all around us, and of course, very much a homogenizing quality. Everywhere tends to look very much like everywhere else through their very obvious selection and depiction of certain features on the map. On the one hand, these maps are instantly familiar and arguably reassuring, a ubiquitous global cartographic brand. But on the other, they erase the local and the vernacular, not just in terms of the landscape, but also in terms of more national or local cartographies. It's easy to link the rise of nationalism as one response or reaction to a globalized world, and paradoxically, Google, in erasing the local and the national, may be promoting it in another way. It's easier to see the direct cartographic reactions through the work of the XYZ Map Company based in Dalkeith, whose owner has been a very public supporter of Scottish independence. XYZ produced in 2013 their own Scottish British Isles political map, an aspirational view of an independent Scotland and the different colourings for the United Kingdom of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, distinctive and separate. So what can we say by way of conclusion? Well, first we should try to understand Scotland's maps and mapping in terms of the context of their making in relation to different ideas of utility and economics and different experiences of technical change. Before the mid-16th century, in terms of maps used to illustrate particular conceptions of the classical world, Scotland hardly figures at all. In terms of the use of maps for state purposes, for knowing the bounds and contents of the nation, Scotland was at the heart of such development, certainly as they were employed in Europe from the late 16th century, definitively so from 1654. By the 17th century, Scotland was one of the best mapped countries in the world. In and since the Enlightenment, Scotland has been increasingly put to order on the map, bounded on paper, mass-produced. Its dimensions increasingly well known, and well known to an increasingly large number of people. These maps both reflect geographical and historical knowledge, but they also help to create it. They help produce such knowledge precisely because in the absence of direct encounter with faraway lands or the unknown nearer to home, the map becomes a powerful means of representing and imagining space, of producing geographic meaning, even if the map does not conform in conventional cartographic fashion to the real world that it symbolizes. Scotland has a distinguished map history, and what I would like to suggest is that the country's maps have acted to produce a distinctive form to Scotland at certain moments and in certain ways. Maps help shape nations. They produce and reinforce national identity and unity, just as much as nations make maps. Thank you very much.